It was not written in the stars that this young boy would one day start his own business and become a great inventor of his time. He was born with a natural curiosity and a very strong will, always struggling to do things better, always wanting to do more for his company, for his employees, and for society. Paul Dewey Jensen was one of a kind. Paul Dewey Jensen was born on the 19th of May 1912. He lived together with his brother and his parents at the local poorhouse in Sale, just outside Bjerringbro. His father, Niels Jensen, was the manager of this public-run facility house for the poor and needy, a circumstance that had a long-lasting impact on the young boy, Paul.
He was very well aware and very early aware of social problems, poor people's problems, and I'm sure that this really influenced his way of thinking and understanding the new world he came into.
His life was also filled with joy and happiness. He was helping on the farm with the cattle and working in the fields. But then the family was struck by tragedy.
Unfortunately, Paul lost his mother very early in his life. Only 6 years old, his mother fell away. In fact, there were a brother in his home as well, but this older brother, in fact, were killed by an accident in the kitchen, which was, of course, also a tragedy for the whole family.
Paul was now living alone with his father, and he therefore often went on his own. His father was busy taking care of the poorhouse, and Paul had time to explore the world. It was just after World War I, and a lot of new inventions were developed, and also came all the way to Sale. Paul saw a bus for the first time, and down at the grocery, he had a chance to touch it and smell the hot engine. Paul didn't go to school every day. In summer, 2 days, and in winter, 4 days. Altogether, he went there for 7 years, and especially math had his interest.
I think he was a smart boy in many ways, and I'm sure that he picked up the basic things, and that helped him to carry on with his young life after he left the school. In his little older childhood, when he came up towards the teenage age, of course he were also together with his father Niels talking about what shall Paul do when he grows up.
His father had left the poorhouse and had bought a small farm outside of Bjerringbro. He was hoping his son would take over the place, but Paul had other plans.
Paul wanted to be a carpenter, and my grandfather took him to Bjerringbro, which were the larger town in the neighborhood, and there were no job for him to get there as a carpenter. So my grandfather said, well, what can we then do? And then he went to a little machine shop in Bjerringbro called Svensson's Machine Factory. And there were a job for the young Paul. So he actually became an apprentice in this small machine shop.
Only 14 years old, he left his father and the farm and moved to the city, where he lived at a boarding home. A whole new world opened for Paul.
And again, by coincidence, the working place by Svensson's were right up to the back garden of the owner of a sawmill in Bjerringbro called Martin Bach. Martin Bach had 3 daughters. And one of these daughters were Inger, my mother. And Inger, this young girl, were running over the courtyard of the machine factory on her way up to school. He was very creative, Paul, and already in his apprentice time by Svenssons, he was developing new tools and various new machine parts that were helping Svenssons machine factory quite a lot. So he became really a very well appreciated young person in the machine factory. And he came to love the blacksmith's job. He came to love the steel, came to love the smell of oil, and he became a very, very good tool maker, in fact, during these young years.
Paul lived in various places in Bjerringbro, but always carrying his wooden box.
This wooden box were in fact filled with chemicals. So Paul, he experimented with these chemicals, and I'm sure he made a gunpowder, and he made other chemicals that were probably also explosive. So at a certain point when apparently something happened, the family where he lived and had his room was saying, "You can't stay here anymore because of your experiments." So he had to move again. But I remember later when I was born and in my first young years in our home that he still had that wooden box with chemicals with him.
Then again, Paul was struck by tragedy. Only 17 years old, he lost his father and became an orphan. Paul continued to work hard at Svenssons machine factory, and he graduated in 1932. In the next 12 months, he was laid off from time to time. He felt he was missing knowledge. He was eager to learn more.
He learned quickly, and his brain were in a way, created so that he understood mathematics and technical things very, very well. In fact, later in his life, it became obvious that Paul Lud Jensen were a technical genius in many, many aspects.
He studied mechanical engineering for a year, but he had to quit because he ran out of money. Disappointed, he went back to Bjerringbro and got his old job back. It was in the middle of the 30s, and unemployment was very high. Not being able to finish his studies annoyed him for a long time, and that may have been one of the reasons why he later, in the 60s, offered his workers evening classes in various subjects. Here, the students are practicing German. After becoming a foreman, he married Inger Johanne Bach in 1938, and they moved into this rented villa in Oostergade 41. Little did he know that this house should play a vital role in the developing of Grundfos.
Right here where I am standing, we are in the first workshop of Grundfos, where my father started in his basement in 1944 with 2 employees. A very small place, but that is the important beginning. My father had his fine and good job as a very valued foreman at Svenssons machine factory. He was However, in some or another way, more and more became more and more impatient. Something were coming to Paul more and more. That's my clear feeling. He wanted, in spite of his good job, to start his own career as an independent. He wanted really to start his own blacksmith shop. So I think that was then in some way the beginning of what we call Jorontofs. But it was not called Jorontofs in the very first years when he started. It was called Bjerringbro Pressestøberi and Machine Factory. And of course this name comes from the fact that Paul Jensen did not have in his mind to make a living out of producing and developing pumps. That was something that came to Paul later.
In the beginning he was on his own, but soon he started to employ people, working in the basement, making heat installations, plumbing and typical blacksmith work. In 1944, he erected this metal workshop of 200 square meters. Paul Jensen had great plans for the future, but was still looking for the right product.
A farmer in the neighborhood were actually asking him to if he could install a motorized water pump for his farm. Paul, he looked at this opportunity and this job possibility, and he realized that he could not buy a pump. And he could not buy a pump because it was during the end of the Second World War and there were no pumps available for him to buy. And then Paul, of course, could have turned back to the farmer and said, "I'm sorry, I cannot help you with a motorized pumping system because I can't buy a pump." And had he did so, I think there would never have been a company called Jorontofs. But what he did was, instead of accepting that he couldn't buy a pump, he said, "If I cannot buy a pump, why don't I make a pump?" So he started to actually design his first pump, still not knowing that pumps should be his future life and future business.
The first Foss was delivered in 1946 and was, from the beginning, a success. And it also got nicknamed the Pig because it resembled the animal. The next series were improved in many ways and got the new name Jorontofs. In 1947, Paul Jensen introduced the Djupfoss, the first deep well pump that could go below 7 meters. In the following years, he focused more and more on producing pumps, and in 1949, the first pump was sold to Norway. Paul Jensen was constantly expanding into new areas and into new markets. And a growing business needs more space. He had now bought Oostergade at 41, and every year he was expanding the factory.
So Jorontofs expanded, so step by step, over the first 10-15 years, right out from his private home. I think that was the way he really liked it, because he was able to, on the one hand, be so close to his home, and on the other hand, be right next to his business. So he spent, of course, time here in the home with kids, and dining and sleeping. But most of the hours where he was awake, he went to the business. The Danish market were sufficient for Paul Dud Jensen the first 10 to 15 years. His key customers were farmers, waterworks, and various smaller industries. But in the late 50s, Paul Dud Jensen, then of course, as many other young companies, started to look for export opportunities, and he had also, of course, contacts from abroad. He also participated in foreign exhibitions.
He went to Norway, Sweden and Germany and met people from all over the world, creating many new long-lasting relationships with customers.
I think right from the beginning, Paul Dud Jensen were ambitious. He wanted to grow his company. There were some important things that he practiced for achieving that. He first of all were very close to his customers, and he built a very loyal customer base. That is very valuable. But he built that customer base by designing high-quality products. He wanted his products to work day and night, and they did work. He has designed products that, so to say, never seem to fail after 30, 40 years. But it was close to him all the time that quality should be exceptional. We shall remember that Paul, he, right from the beginning, built his own tools, built his own machinery for his pumps. He thought that he should not only design pumps, but he should also, as a fundamental thing, design machines and tools for producing his pumps. In this way, he could shortcut a lot of work time, you know, and make it much more efficient. One fantastic example, of course, is when Paul Dud Jensen, in his late age, designed the so-called Joront's carousels. I think that invention he did there has been of an enormous value to Joront's. And here in 2012, I think there's still some of his carousels working day and night. How many engineers and designers can tell such a story? I think it's only a very few.
Østergade 41 was also the home of the family Dewey Yinsen, and living close to the factory meant that everybody was part of the business. The family was now counting 4 children also, Birda, Niels, Estriel and Inger Maria.
This very dining table here was of course the place where we were all sitting nearly every day. And my 2 sisters here, my older sister there, and I was sitting there, and my father at the end, and my mother here, where I'm sitting.
But often the family was not dining alone.
They had many guests coming. They had customers coming to his home. My mother were willingly serving lunch and dinners, and they had often customer guests and also key employees staying at their home during night time. So this also meant a lot for us young children, because we listened during our whole childhood to many business talks. After the supper and after having maybe helped us children with some schoolwork, which he sometimes did, he went back to work. And many times I went with him as the young boy and sat beside him, and he was making drawings, you know, on these drawing boards where his engineers were sitting every day and drawing, and he then made a small sketch and then put it on the drawing board, and the next morning when the engineer or technician came in, he could look at that and they said, so yes, I understand what he means. And very often there were a very good idea or a real problem solution. And employees, they could really judge his spirit and humor by looking at his hat. If the hat was so pulled down here, right next, close to the eyes, then they should take care of him, and they should not get too close to him. And that was particularly in the morning time. When the hat was so more up here, then they knew he was in a good mood and full of joy, and then it was good to talk with him.
But no matter what mood he was in, he was always working on new projects and working on building up his business.
I think deep in Paul, there were a wish to make things better. And he was a technical genius, and he had many ideas as to how things could be done better, technical things. And of course, he had to finish his designs, and so he could make a production. But I'm sure in the back of his mind, he was always thinking about things to improve in the technical design. I think we can really say that Paul were relentlessly ambitious in his way of making and developing his whole business. So he was all the time in a very close and direct contact with his key customers. I think that is a very important fact, in fact, and a big part of, or maybe his success. He was close to the customer, and he got their feedback as to what they felt could be done better. He never let customers down. Had he made something that didn't work 100% satisfactory, then he changed it for them.
When Paul Dewey Jensen started his own business, he first employed some of his colleagues from Svensson's machine factory. Many of them stayed for many years. In 1952, he already had 40 people working in the fast-growing business.
They moved over to him and wanted to be part of his team and his success. My father and mother were in fact very close to many of our workers. They were They were participating in family occasions, you know, confirmation of workers' children, marriages, and so they were actually very close related and to the first employees, and of course that created a great loyalty. And you cannot imagine anything more important than having loyal employees and loyal workers around you. That is so important, and that makes the whole difference. Loyalty creates engagement, creates, also employees wish to do something which they were not told to do, you know, take extra steps. And it gives a motivation, and in fact, Paul and Inger, they developed their company as a family. I shall also tell you that Paul had more or less only employees that loved to work for Grundfos. The ones that didn't like Paul, because there were also employees that didn't like Paul's temper and his way of acting. They didn't stay long in Grundfos. Paul were in many ways a tough guy. He was a very tough guy, but he was also a tough guy with an exceptionally soft heart.
Paul took care of his workers, and he was among the first business owners to employ disabled people in the production. That happened in 1968, and today that has spread to all Grundfos companies. In 1960, Paul Dewey Jensen combined all his products under the name Grundfos, and he had started production in Germany, in Weltsted, a decision that should be the beginning of the globalization of Grundfos.
He built an organization there because he wanted to produce in Germany. And he knew in his heart and in his stomach that he could not make a major success in Germany without producing locally. And he then also started, together with production, a sales organization. He wanted at a certain point to start his own sales organizations around, as he had done it in Denmark. And this whole philosophy, starting own sales organizations, growing own sales organizations, using local labor and local management, has been our principle right from Paul Dewey Jensen's early times, and we are still hanging on to that principle.
After Germany, he opened companies in the UK, France, Austria, Holland, and other countries, building a very strong base in expanding to Western Europe. As the company was growing, the number of visitors and guests increased rapidly. Soon the house in Oostergade 41 was not big enough to entertain them all, and he started using Madsen's hotel in the city. But he wanted a place of his own.
That was the time when he started, around in the mid of the 1960s, to think about maybe it would be good for him and for Grundfos to acquire a guest house. A guest house for a Danish company were a very unusual thing, but he looked around, and just by coincidence, very near to his hometown Sal, he found Friesholt. That house he bought in 1965, and then started a major renovation of this old house, and in a year or 1.5 years it was brought up to a very fine standard.
Over the years, thousands of guests have stayed at Friesholt, and many have arrived in the company plane. In the beginning it was a propeller, but soon Paul Dewey Jensen bought a company jet.
And the morning they landed in Billund with the Learjet was a fantastic day for my father and of course for all of us. And now my father had even better, of course, possibilities to invite customers from all over Europe in his new Learjet. And so he did, so it meant thousands of customers coming to Gronfos, seeing the factory, having good talks and enjoying Friesholt, good entertainment and food and accommodation there. I think whenever I have asked customers, what is it you remember from your visits to Gronfos? They normally would tell me and others, you have some beautiful and very clean factories, and then you have a wonderful guest house, Friesholt.
In order to grow, Paul Dewey Jensen needed more space. In 1963, he revealed his plans for the 35 acres of land he had bought just north of the city. He was going to expand intensively in Grundfos in the coming years, and also in the city. Developing Bjerringbro and making it an attractive city for both the citizens and the employees was very high on his agenda. During this period, he erected a lot of new homes for new employees, besides building his new factory.
And he, in fact, were elected for 2 times 4 years to serve on the local city board in Bjerringbro. And that were in the days where it was more simple, so to say, to be a city board member than it is today. And there were only a small administration around managing the community. But I think he did some good things there. I think it became clear that he did not have enough patience. He was too impatient to really stay in local politics. And I think he also created some unfriendships during that period, but of course he wanted the best for his little city.
Eventually, Paul lost his patience with both local and national politicians, and he decided to move to Germany in 1971. He spent several years there, making the German factory a fast-growing success, but still taking care of the factory in Bjerringbro that had just celebrated the first 25 years in business the year before.
Det vi fejrer I dag 25 år fra den første pumpe.
Grundfos was now exporting 8 out of 10 pumps. The turnover had exceeded 100 million kroner, double up compared to the year before. And Paul was eager to try out new markets. So far, he had only few experiences with the North American continent, but now was the time.
About 1975, my father said, now I'm ready for going to USA and starting Gronfos in USA. And he went right to Clovis, and he established himself there already, I think, in 1973, purchasing a rather important 32 acres of land in Clovis. And in 1975 he decided personally to move to Clovis and start to build himself a normal life there, started to develop a sales company and started a small production base in USA. So that was, I think, his final ambition in life, to really put Gronfos on the map of USA.
But Paul Dewey Jensen never got to harvest the fruits of his American adventure.
Unfortunately, Paul passed away in 1977, but he managed to see that we had built our first factory there in 1976, and he had been there for the inauguration, and he could see that there were a young manager team and a group of employees, and he saw also the first Grundfos carousel being moved into the factory and saw it start UP circulator pump houses. And he was there right with his hands to make sure, together with the local people, that this carousel was set up and working.
A few years before Paul Dewey Jensen passed away, he started thinking about the future. What should become of Grundfos when he was no longer around? To continue the strong growth and secure the free and independent future for the company and all the employees, he first established a Swiss-based holding company, and then, later on in 1975, he established the major owner of the whole group, the Paul Dewey Jensen Foundation.
I think he did that because he apparently had seen too many family conflicts potentially that could develop or had developed. And that is not to say that he thought that were going to happen with his own family, but so to say he didn't want to take that risk. And me as the only son of Paul, I can say I think that was a fantastic and a very, very important decision and one of his last major decisions.
The Paul Dewey Jensen Foundation is a self-governing institution, and it owns about 85% of the shares in Grundfos Holding. The family members own about 12%, and the rest belongs to the employees. The main purpose of the foundation is to continue the development of Grundfos and to reinvest the profits in the Grundfos companies.
When Paul Dewey Jensen passed away in 1977, he handed over to us a very important legacy. First of all, some very sound business principles. For instance, that we should never in Grundfos spend more money on fixed investments than we were earning ourselves. He also handed over to us a high degree of social responsibility towards employees and towards the local society. This is a principle that has followed Grundfos ever since. And finally, he handed over to us a number of family values that were high degree of trust among employees, respect for each other, tolerance for each other, and also giving a high degree of support to each other when we needed it. So real family values that are meant to hold a whole family and, let me say, hold a company together.
The legacy after Paul Dewey Jensen is evident still today. It is part of the way we act, the way we do business, and the way we work together. It is in our DNA. In all aspects, he laid the foundation for Grundfos. Though he had a hard start in life, he was able, against many odds, to create his own business. He started in 1945. One man, one idea, one vision. Today, Grundfos has grown to cover the world.